NVIDIA at CES 2026 has launched DLSS 4.5. Now normally I'd be going in and testing out the new super resolution second generation transformer model back at my studio, back in my office, but unfortunately we're still here in Las Vegas, and that is definitely an unfortunate thing. But nevertheless, we're going to be testing out, or at least checking out, NVIDIA's new DLSS 4.5 in their demo suite in just a moment. So we'll have a little bit of a hands-on time looking at it, taking a look at some of the improvements that they've made to things like particle quality, lighting, sizzling, all that sort of stuff, so you'll be able to see that. On top of that, NVIDIA's also announced dynamic frame generation. So the idea being to just run the FPS in your game as high as your monitor can handle. They're also pairing that with a new 6x frame generation mode. So I've had some hands-on time with that. That is not launched just yet, but I'll give you some at least brief indications of how it performs, what it feels like to play with the 6x frame generation mode. So let's get into it. Thanks to MSI for sponsoring our CES coverage. Check out MSI's gaming desktops, inside of which you'll find powerful AMD Ryzen or Intel Core Ultra processors, NVIDIA GeForce RTX graphics with ray tracing and DLSS, and the latest connectivity, including up to PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, Wi-Fi 7 and 5GB LAN. MSI's Silent Storm cooling AI uses smart fan algorithms and separated airflow chambers, combined with up to 360mm AIOs, to keep temperatures low and minimize noise under load. There's tempered glass side panels, clean interiors, and excellent designs to choose from. Learn more about MSI's gaming desktops via the links in the description.
Also supporting our CES coverage is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryo Sheet, an excellent alternative to thermal pastes, and because they don't use any liquid, they can never dry out. These graphene thermal pads offer very high thermal conductivity, are easy to use, are extremely durable, and can be used to maximize your CPU and/or GPU's cooling performance. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. We'd also like to thank Endorphy, creators of the award-winning Fluctus fans, available in both 120 and 140mm. These high-performance fans are designed to move air efficiently in dense spaces, with focused airflow and reduced noise. Perfect for CPU, power supplies, PC cases, and more. So to learn more, please click the links in the video description.
So here at CES 2026, I'm getting my first hands-on look at the new DLSS 4.5 second generation transformer model for super resolution. Of course, this is available for anyone to use right now, so I'm sure a lot of you have been checking it out in the latest NVIDIA app beta version, but we're currently here at the show floor, so I haven't been able to do too much in-depth testing just yet, but you will see that on the channel. So NVIDIA have got a setup here where they're looking at Black Myth Wukong. This is in the 4K performance mode. And what we're able to do is just use the keyboard here to toggle between the first generation and the second generation models. So that's going from the K model, which is the old first generation model, to the M model, which is used for the 4K performance mode. There's also a new L model for ultra performance, which I don't think there is a demo of here, but is supposed to be pretty significantly improved, given that for the first gen model it didn't get too much love. So there's a couple of things that I immediately noticed when toggling between the two models. So I think we'll zoom in and have a look at the particle effects that we're seeing around here in the background. So this is Black Myth Wukong using the first generation transformer model, and then we switch over to the second gen model, and you can start to see many more particles and a much stronger level of illumination as well. The older model is much darker and harder to see. The newer model is much brighter. So I think this will be pretty beneficial for people that have HDR panels. You'll be able to see these sorts of tiny particle effects. And there's another demo we saw over there with, I think it's Outer Worlds 2. If you look at the backgrounds, nice and starry. We might have some B-roll of this, but a starry background, you flick over to the new model and you get much brighter elements for those really fine pixel level details, which again looks amazing on an OLED screen. So if we flick it over here to look at another one of the new benefits of the second gen transformer model, you can see up in here with the first gen version that there's quite a lot of flickering and sizzling in this foliage area. This is kind of a known problem with DLSS 4. You get these really fine details, and if they're moving a little bit, you'll see some flicker. If we move over to the second generation model, this is much clearer. So while we're not getting, the trees are no longer quite as thick with all of those little details here, this looks much more natural because this is a far away foliage tree branch element. So they should be really, really tiny details. And so that area looks significantly better. And also, if you were noticing just in this area in general, there's a lot of moving particles throughout the screen. So when we flick back to the old model, you can see quite a bit of ghosting as these particles move across the screen. You'll see some streaks and things as they're moving around. With the second generation model, that also looks to be quite substantially improved with all the particles in that area. So those are some of the immediate, most impressive things you can assess in the games when just flicking between the two models, and you should be able to see that across quite a number of games if those artifacts are present. But it does depend on the game engine, of course. So if you're seeing ghosting in a title, for that to be improved with the new second generation model, it has to be caused by the DLSS K version model with first generation transformer. If the ghosting is caused by some other element, the new DLSS 4.5 may not be as beneficial, so it just depends on the situation that you're looking at. Another thing that they told me here at the NVIDIA booth that was super interesting was around how lighting is being handled with DLSS 4.5. So with the previous model, the tone mapping pass was being done before the super resolution was being applied. With DLSS 4.5, tone mapping is being done after. So they've moved the super resolution a step before the tone mapping process and is now being done in the linear light space. So what that means is that you can get much more accurate lighting into the super resolution model, which has been a problem with previous temporally anti-alias solutions. So one of the most obvious things that they're demoing here in Black Myth Wukong is this sort of floor area here where you can see quite a number of details and light reflections. If we flick back over to the old model, you'll see that there's not quite as much lighting, not as much specular reflections and nice highlight detail in that area. And when we flick back to the newer model, there's much more lighting here. I'm sure some people are going to say things like, well, which one of these two is accurate? Like, which is the truth, the true image? And well, to do that, you basically have to turn off anti-aliasing entirely, because TAA also does the lighting pass after the tone mapping. But bringing that in beforehand is going to give you much more improvements, and applies to that particle stuff that we saw previously, where it looks brighter, it's going to look better on an OLED screen. That is all thanks to this new solution that they've come up with, DLSS 4.5. And here we see this lighting effect again with these candles. The luminance level is just a lot higher with the new DLSS 4.5 model. And this is an SDR display that we're looking at here. So I'm sort of projecting and saying this will look better on an HDR screen. Of course, we're going to have to test that back when we're in Australia. But yeah, it's a super noticeable difference in this particular game. It's going to depend on the game, of course, as to how much of a difference this will make. But NVIDIA claims that this is meant to be a much more accurate version. So there's a few other things to be aware of here. Now, hopefully by the time that this video is published, Steve will have published his performance breakdown of the new DLSS 4.5 versus DLSS 4.4. So you will know that there is a performance impact associated with running these new models. Now, NVIDIA says that this does depend quite heavily on the render resolution of the title. So if you're using, say, the quality mode or DLAA, with the new 4.5, especially at higher resolutions, you'll probably see more of a performance impact even on the latest RTX 50 and RTX 40 GPUs. And I think Steve tested the quality mode throughout his testing. Again, I haven't seen his video just yet, but I believe he's tested the quality mode. So that's where you see one of the larger performance impacts. If you go down to the performance mode, which is being demoed here, the performance impact shouldn't be as much because you're rendering at a lower render resolution. So that's something to be aware of. Of course, in addition to that, you would have seen higher performance loss when using it on the RTX 30 and 20 series GPUs. So while the quality is going to be better on those GPUs, you are going to get a much more significant performance loss when enabling the new DLSS M preset. So you might want to flick back to the K preset. There's a couple of other things that I've been talking to NVIDIA about here. One is related to ray reconstruction. So some people have been enabling ray reconstruction after enabling DLSS 4.5 and seeing not as much of a quality impact. That is because the ray reconstruction model, which combines both DLSS super resolution model and ray reconstruction into one, has not been upgraded for DLSS 4.5 with the second gen super resolution just yet. So if you enable ray reconstruction in a game, it just uses the old first generation, I guess, quote unquote version. So that's why if that feature is enabled, you're not seeing these quality benefits. Secondly, we were talking about these sort of challenges that are being faced with DLSS 4.5 on different GPU generations. So in the NVIDIA app, if you just go and enable the latest model, that's always going to use the M model across all of the GPUs, regardless of whether it's 40, 50, or 20 and 30 series. But of course, there's a larger performance impact on those older GPUs. So what I've sort of suggested to NVIDIA is maybe using a preset, something along the lines of best model, that will use the M preset on the newer GPUs and maybe the K preset on the older GPUs. They've certainly heard that feedback from people, so no promises of whether they'll do something like that, but I think it would be a good addition to the NVIDIA app that will just make the process a bit more streamlined for people. So yeah, so far DLSS 4.5 has been super impressive. I'm going to go and compare that in some of our test samples that we've looked at previously in 2025. We'll run that test suite through on DLSS 4.5 as well, but you'll see that in a couple of weeks when we're back from CES. Let's go look at something that you actually can't use just yet, which is the new dynamic frame generation mode. So this is a demo of the new dynamic frame generation mode that NVIDIA will be providing with DLSS 4.5 in an update in the spring. So while the super resolution model is available right now, this is coming, I guess, in a couple of months. And this is spring for North America, so let's be clear, it's not coming in like 6 months when it's Australian spring, North American spring. So the key benefit that they're touting with the dynamic mode is it's really meant to just peg the game at your maximum monitor's refresh rate. So we're looking at 240 Hz monitors here. When you play around, I know they're sort of showing this weird man's chest at the moment, but basically as you play around in the game, it's going to adjust the level of frame generation depending on the render rate of the title. So in this example, we might show some B-roll. If you head out to things like the windows where it's not rendering as much stuff, it drops down the frame generation amount because the render rate of the game is higher. But when you get into a more intense scenario, it's going to increase the frame generation amount up to now 6x. So that is going to benefit people, especially that have really high refresh rate monitors. So 240 Hz with 6th gen frame generation, the base render rate is not amazing, but if you have a 360 Hz or especially a 500 Hz monitor, 6 times frame generation is going to give you a base render rate of 80 FPS. That's pretty nice and smooth. So that's where the 6x frame generation mode is going to give people the most benefit. As far as the dynamic mode goes, I think this is a pretty good idea, just because a lot of the time when you're trying to optimize the level of frame generation in titles, it can really depend on the scene that you're looking at. You don't necessarily want to enable like a 3x or 4x mode in a more intense scene in the game, only to find out that later on frame generation is just going nuts and going well above your monitor's refresh rate and giving you really no benefit. So having this dynamic mode that will adjust things and keep things within your monitor's refresh rate makes a lot of sense to me. Also, they've told us that it will even disable frame generation if it's not required. So if you're playing on a monitor that's of a lower refresh rate, like 120, 144, 165 Hz, where you may run into those scenarios where frame generation really isn't required, you can still enable the dynamic frame generation mode that will boost up the performance in some situations, but largely just operate in an off state. The thing that's going to be interesting to look at with this configuration is how things like latency go in between the changes in the level of frame generation. So especially if you go from something like off to on, is that going to drop your render rate a lot? These are the sorts of things that we're going to have to explore when we test this, I guess, when it's released in the spring. So the other thing that NVIDIA told us is that they'll be releasing a new B model for frame generation, so I guess a second generation model for that as well. That is not being demoed here, but will be available in that spring update with DLSS 4.5 and the dynamic frame gen. The key benefit that they've told us that this will include is the ability to provide frames to frame generation before the UI pass. So this is going to require some form of game integration, of course, but the ability to provide those frames prior to the UI being rendered is going to give them a lot more ability to resolve things like the garbling that we see in some UI elements. It'll all go into the model and hopefully provide a much higher level of quality. So that's something that we have seen with frame generation previously. One of the issues, the garbled UI elements, NVIDIA are trying to solve that with this latest model that will be available a bit later. The latency side of things with dynamic frame generation is certainly interesting because, of course, as the modes ramp up and down, you're going to get different latency throughout the game. So here, for example, we're running now in a 6x frame generation mode, so there is an increase in latency, and it does feel, maybe slightly slower to use. And you will have seen the stats in the top corner of the screen where the latency does increase. But then if we go back out here to the area where we can get the frame generation working in the 4x mode, the latency situation does start to improve, as I think we saw even as low as 3x there for just a moment. So as you move around and as it's changing the modes, it's going to be pretty interesting through longer gameplay sessions. Obviously this is only a demo session right now. It's going to be pretty interesting to see how the game feels over time as we sort of switch in between the different modes. It feels pretty seamless, but of course, as you start moving from place to place and start doing things like this, you do notice the increased latency from the 6x mode, but I'm thinking more about like the changes, like as it's ramping up and down, are you suddenly going to start feeling sluggish or something like that? It's going to take a bit more exploration to get a bit of a feel for how this sort of technology works, because of course the latency is a very important aspect of frame generation. So, you know me, I'm not like the hugest fan of frame generation. I like it in some titles, I don't like it in other titles, so it will be a case-by-case basis as to whether dynamic frame gen works. And with things like 6 times frame generation, of course, people are going to be making memes about this, fake frames and all of that. I get it. 6X is not going to be the mode that a lot of people are going to want to use or even make sense in a lot of situations. However, I do genuinely believe there are benefits with super high refresh rate monitors where you just can't run single player titles at 500 Hz. If the model works really well and provides genuine clarity benefits, when you're running it on those high refresh rate OLED panels, the game should look better. But that's something that we will have to test, of course. So anyway, quite impressive, the demo that we've seen here. I think I've been more impressed with the super resolution stuff. So we'll get back to, as I said, testing that when we get home soon. So yeah. So when we see these demos in a controlled environment in NVIDIA's demo suite, we are seeing these things in the best light. NVIDIA has controlled all of these demos so that we can see the best of the best when it comes to DLSS 4.5 and the dynamic frame generation. So read into all of this with a grain of salt. It will require some much more in-depth testing to see where the quality improvements for the super resolution model apply across a wide variety of games, not just in ideal scenarios. So we are going to be testing that fully within the next couple of weeks once we get back from CES. So that'll be on Hardware Unboxed. Hopefully you'll have already seen the performance testing that Steve has done on DLSS 4.5 to give you a bit of an indication on how it goes on a range of GPU generations. So check that out on Hardware Unboxed if we've already published it. And then with the dynamic frame generation and stuff, that is coming a bit later on, so we'll test that when it's available. But apart from that, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.